Now that you have read The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, you're at least familiar with the story now. When it comes time to criticize or to analyze, there are many different ways to approach it. The first thing you need to do is just be able to understand the story as it's presented. So, of course, you've read the story, you see how there's a virus, this horrible plague terrorizing the town. And so what happens, the prince says, alright, come on buddies. And he takes his friends up into his castle, locks up the doors, and they say, to heck with the people, let them all die down there, we're going to have a party. And they have a party. But of course they cannot escape the Red Death. Somehow the Red Death gets in and kills them all in the end. The end. That's pretty much the plot of the story. So, when we actually start analyzing it though, there's a lot more going on in that story, a lot more that Poe included. So why all these extra details? So the first thing we do is we look at it in the traditional method, and that means we look at author's techniques, the writer's craft. So things like Poe starts off using fairly short sentences, so that you're moving almost at a quick pace as you're reading it. And the Red Death did this, and the Red Death did that, and then this was a problem, and the Prince Prospero, who was a wise and sagacious man, he did this, and then that happened, and then this happened, and then we finally get into the castle, and then Poe slows it down. When we get to the party, especially when he's describing the clock, he slows things down by putting in these long sentences with lots of commas, lots of ands, parentheses, and he stretches them out, and this forces us to slow down as the reader. And this makes us uncomfortable. We don't like long run-on sentences. We're actually more comfortable with short sentences. And so he's accomplishing his purpose. We're getting uncomfortable. For example, when he says, and then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies. There's some irony for you. He's talking about the time that flies, and he's telling it to you in the terms of 3,600 seconds. It's a huge number. He's slowing us down. And here comes the chiming of the clock. And everyone pauses, and everyone's nervous. He gets you into that creepy feeling, and then he goes back to the almost rhythmic sentences, and then everyone laughs, ha, ha, and the dancing begins, and they do this, and they do that, and la 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 la, and everything goes on fine, and then, boom, another long sentence, the clock starts again with the boom, boom, boom. So, he's really good at establishing this feeling without you even realizing it's happening. Now, metaphorical, and this is probably another one that you're very familiar with, it's where we look for symbols. And you remember the last lesson, we talked about symbols a lot. First of all, we have the Red Death. It's not the Black Death, it's not the Blue Death, it's the Red Death. So what does red usually symbolize? Well, we connect it instantly with blood. So, since in this particular plague, the blood oozes out your pores, we've got the Red Death. So, our metaphor has already begun. Our symbols are already pouring in with the very first sentence, heck with the title. There are 6 really strong symbols that run through this to help build the overall metaphor of this story. Or you could call it the lesson to be learned, the moral of the story. The first of them is Prince Prospero. First, let's look at the fact that he is a prince. What is the job of a prince? A prince is supposed to take care of his people. He is the government, and the government's job is to make sure that the people are healthy and able to move forward, to progress. What happens when the plague hits? Prospero locks himself up and says, to heck with the people, let them all die. Not exactly what a government is supposed to be doing. Plus, his name is Prospero, and we're told that he is sagacious. Sagacious means wise. Prospero, when we hear that name, we think of the word prosperous. And prosperous, of course, means to do well, to be successful, to have great health, and great education, great wisdom, and lots of money and property and good food and all the things that you need to be happy in life. So Prospero definitely was that. Now we then look at the next symbol, the gates and bolts of the palace. Well, this is minor, it seems like, because it goes by pretty fast. They welded shut the gates and bolts of the palace. Now it's important that we look at the fact they were welded shut. They left means neither of ingress nor egress. You cannot get in or out. What does that mean? You're sealed in. Not only can't the people get into the castle, but you can't get back out. If something goes wrong, you're trapped. That's important to know, that the gates and the bolts represent an actual trap. This is a bigger part of, this is a smaller part of a bigger problem. We've just actually made the problem worse. The plague is running through the city. Great. What's he do? He locks himself up so that if something goes wrong in there, he's really in bad shape. Now the 7 rooms, this is really difficult to understand the first time you read the story. You really have to go back and look at those couple of paragraphs several times. The 7 rooms. If you remember, I gave you a little chart, a little graphic that showed you the rooms in the order. They had the braziers outside the windows. Now, the braziers were flickering flames. It's important to know that flickering flames create dancing shadows. The light seems to move all around. It doesn't stay steady. It's not like a light bulb where we have constant steady light. A flame creates flickering light. If you've ever been at a campfire at night, it looks like there's things out there in the bushes because the light's dancing and moving the shadows around. So he's creating, as they say, as Poe says, phantasms in the rooms just by the way the shadows move. So each of the rooms is a different color. I used to think that the different colors were really important, but they're not. It's just enough to help set us up for the 7th room. Now we have 7 rooms that we move through. The number 7 is important here. The first room starts in the east. The last room ends in the west. What travels from east to west? The sun. What is there also 7 of? 7 days in the week. The rooms represent the passage of time. Notice that the last room has a clock. Okay? So the 7 rooms are reminding us that time is passing. So while the people are in there partying and trying not to think about what's going on down in the village, time is still passing. They are wasting that time. They are throwing it away. So they're living their lives, going through their routine, and they're just partying, and they're not accomplishing anything. They're not doing anything constructive with that time. They're just wasting that time on pleasure. So that's really the whole purpose of the 7 rooms. The last room is the black room. This Poe also spends a lot of time describing. Its walls and floor are covered in carpets and tapestries of black velvet. Velvet is soft. Sable, it's soft. It's plush. When you step on it, you don't make a sound. It actually absorbs sound. So the sound of the orchestra gets in there, and it's muffled. The sound of the clock is muffled. It's very creepy. So it's bad enough you're in a black room with a black clock ticking at you, but remember the windows are different here. Here the windows are the color red. So the light flashing through is creating this blood red color dancing around in this black room. It is creepy in the utmost. So people just don't want to be back there. They stay away from it. But remember, it's also the last room of 7. It's in the west where the sun sets. It is the end of your journey. So if we're talking about the passing of time, or in this case, people's lives, that 7th room is death. It's the end. So when you look at it from that point of view, that room gets even creepier. No wonder nobody wants to go in there. It's like going to a funeral home. Who wants to go in and see a coffin? Ugh, stay away from that room. Okay. Now the revelers They're partying, they're having a ball, they're drinking wine, they're dancing, they're drinking, they're probably doing cocaine, they're probably having sex, they're doing all kinds of crazy, wild things and just enjoying the heck out of themselves because there's no consequences. They're living like there's no tomorrow. And guess what? Because of their actions, there is no tomorrow. Because Prince Prospero has done nothing about the Red Death, it, as Poe says, is raging abroad. It's not slowing down. It just keeps getting worse. And so, the ebony clock is back there trying to remind them every hour. Boom! Boom! Hey, folks, and they all stop. And it's like, remember, time is passing. There's problems. There's things you need to be doing. You have responsibilities. You should be doing them. But then the clock stops, and the orchestra starts again, and everybody starts partying again, and they just forget about the clock. Oh, forget that clock. That clock is stupid. Let's just continue to have fun. We're up here to enjoy ourselves, not to do things that are responsible and have to work. No, let's enjoy ourselves. And so they go back, and so the clock rings again the next hour. Hey! Remember me? Remember what you should be doing? And they all stop and go, oh, that's right. I'm supposed to be doing, I have responsibilities. Oh my gosh. I have things I should be doing out there. But then the clock stops. And since the clock's not busy bugging them, they forget about it and they go back to their drinking and their drugs and their dancing and whatever else they're doing. And finally, the clock reaches midnight. Midnight is important. Whenever you see midnight in a story, whenever you see it in a movie or on a television show, midnight is known as the witching hour. What is so special about midnight? It's considered nether time. It's neither today, nor tomorrow, nor yesterday. It really can't be associated with anything. It's right in between that transition from one day to the next. So it's no longer June 12th. It's moving into June 13th, but yet it's still June 12th at the same time. Which is it? It's neither, but it's both. It's nothing. This is a moment of change, of great power. The witches thought of this as a time when their magic was at its most powerful. You want to cast a great spell, midnight is when it should happen. Notice that this is when Cinderella's carriage turns back into a pumpkin and her dress disappears. Everything falls apart at midnight. So that's the symbol of the clock. Now finally we have the intruder. He comes in dressed like one who is suffering from the Red Death. Like the clock, he is a reminder of what they are trying to avoid. He's a reminder of the greater problems, which upsets Prospero no end, so he charges him. Now at first you think, oh okay, the stranger, the intruder, he represents the Red Death. But he's more than just the Red Death. Yes, he kills all the revelers, all the party people die of the Red Death. But Prospero doesn't. Prospero charges after this guy. Prospero charges quickly through the 7 rooms. Notice that the intruder just takes his time in a stately step. He strides slowly, casually, through the 7 rooms, and finally he arrives in the last room. And then he turns and waits. He's in no hurry. He knows that eventually he'll get everybody. Prospero hurries through the 7 rooms, so he's rushing through his life. He's throwing it away, basically. He charges in, goes after this guy, and the intruder just holds his hand up and Prospero keels over dead. Prospero did not die of the Red Death. Who knows what he died of? Did he have a heart attack, a seizure, a stroke? Was he suddenly deprived of all air? We don't know. He just falls over dead. Why? Because the intruder is not just the Red Death. He is all death. He is the ultimate death. And so we've seen the symbolism. And notice he's also the dog barking. So he is the ultimate end of everything. You cannot escape him. So when we put all these images together, we get this idea that governments are supposed to be responsible. They're supposed to be doing things for their people. They're supposed to take care of them. In this story, they lock the doors and leave them to die. This was not uncommon. we are actually very spoiled that we have a government that we forced to take care of us. If they're not doing their job, we don't re-elect them. We put people in who will do our job, or do that job for us. So Poe is criticizing people of power who are supposed to be doing things and are only worried about themselves, only taking care of themselves. This was a big issue in his society. If we look at things historically, Poe had a lot of inspiration for this story. During his lifetime, there was tuberculosis. There was a huge problem with tuberculosis running around. I'll talk about tuberculosis a little bit more later. But also, just 10 years before he publishes this story, there was this huge cholera outbreak. Now, cholera it's a living organism. I'm not sure if it's actually a bacteria or something a little bit more complicated, like an amoeba or something like that. But it gets into your digestive tract, and it digests your food and leaves you with nothing. It causes you great diarrhea, burning urine. It's a horrible, painful thing, and you basically poop yourself to death. You can't get any nourishment because this organism is living in your bowels, soaking everything up on you. You get a great fever, and all sorts of horrible things happen. Now, how do you get cholera? It's really stupid. You don't hear about cholera nowadays. You know why? Because there's no reason for us to get it. What was happening was, back in the days when we were all an agricultural society, you didn't hear about this then either. Why? Because people lived on a farm, and when they had to go to the bathroom, they went to the outhouse. And when the outhouse started stinking too much, you just filled the hole with dirt and dug a new one and put up a new outhouse. So it really wasn't infecting anything. Now, we moved to the cities, and we have factories now. So we have water pumps, because we don't have ponds and rivers and streams nearby to get our water from. We have to get it from the groundwater. So we're living in the city. Do we have outhouses in the city? Not really. So how do you take care of your waste? You have a chamber pot. You do your business in the pot, and when you're done, you go over to the window and you just dump it out the window into the alley. It runs down the gutters in the alley, and where? And through the storm drains into the ground. It soaks into the ground and flows into, guess what? The drinking water. So the drinking water was basically full of people's waste, their poop and pee. They were drinking their own disgusting, nasty stuff. So they were killing themselves. So like I said, Poe had a lot of things to inspire it. So you can look historically at events of the time and see what might have inspired the story. We can also look at it biographically. Poe had a horribly tragic life. 4 people in his life died from tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a disease where, again, it's like bacteria or some sort of organism gets into the lungs, and it infects the lung tissue, and it causes the lungs to start swelling up with water, and it also breaks down the tissue of the lungs. So after a while you start coughing like with pneumonia, but the difference here is instead of coughing up the fluids, you cough up blood, because the tissues of your lungs aren't strong enough anymore, and they're tearing and shredding from all the coughing, and so you start coughing up blood. And usually by the time you could detect that someone had it, it was probably too late. They were so far gone. They didn't have antibiotics yet. They didn't have a way to treat it. Today, it's an easily treated disease. You almost never hear of it anymore. It's still out there, but it's rare. Poe's mother died when he was only 3 or 4 years old from tuberculosis. His adopted mother died when he was a teenager from tuberculosis. His older brother died when he was an adult, and later his wife died from tuberculosis. 4 people very close to him died from this horrible disease. Do you think maybe that might have been his inspiration for the Red Death? Well, here's something even worse. When his adopted mother was dying of the disease, and she lay in her bed coughing herself to death, her husband just abandoned her. He started bringing in wild, crazy women and having sexual exploits in the very next room, in another bedroom. She could hear him in there. In fact, the servants and Poe could hear him. Everybody knew what was going on in there. Poe thought this was horrible. After all, this is they are husband and wife. Remember the vows, till death do you part, we will care for each other. He abandoned her to die and went off to have his own pleasure. Guy kind of sound like Prospero there. Could also look at it from a sociological point of view. The Deep South. Poe was born in, I'm pretty sure, in Virginia, but if he wasn't born there, he still spent a lot of his life in Virginia. He spent a lot of his adult life in Baltimore. In fact, there's a big museum for him in Baltimore. But he spent most of his childhood in Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. And of course, the Deep South, and Virginia is considered part of the Deep South. They thought of, and remember this is the 1800s before the Civil War, so they looked at themselves as they were basically recreating medieval England, medieval Europe, the lifestyle of King Arthur. They had the rich, super rich, having great balls and living in these big mansions, and having this huge social life with all these rich rules and such of how they were to behave, how a southern lady was supposed to behave, how a southern gentleman was supposed to behave. They basically revived chivalry. Of course, they built it all off their slaves who were doing all the work for them to support them in this lifestyle. So he brings this into play as well. They're living these wild, extravagant lives while people were dying of the Red Death. You could also look at this as while the people were suffering from slavery. New criticism. Remember our Itsy Bitsy Spider story? Well, new criticism just says, let's not even worry about what happened in Poe's life. Let's not worry about all the different diseases he was exposed to. Let's not worry about what happened to his mother and his stepmother, etc. Let's just look at what's happening in our world today. Why do we still like this story? Why does this story still appeal to us? Well, right now, with the coronavirus, I think it's all too obvious. But before the corona hit, we still had AIDS. We had Ebola over in Africa. There are constant waves of diseases running through. And it doesn't just have to be a disease either. It's any situation where we have a big problem that's threatening our way of life, threatening our society, and our government's kind of just like, I don't have time for that. You could talk about, let's say, my brain's blanking here. Global warming. Is global warming real? Well, whatever the situation is, we do have a real problem with the ice is melting and different things are happening. There's still pollution, all sorts of things that are impacting our environment. Way too many trees are being cut down in South America. We need trees to create oxygen for us. What happens when we take down that many trees? Is there going to be enough oxygen around to support all these living creatures? So, what is our government doing to stop it? Not much, because, we need that lumber for our productivity, for our economy. Got to keep the economy going. So there's lots of examples, lots of things beyond just diseases that show how, Black Lives Matter. There's another one. All these times where our government just keeps turning its back on situations that we really need to address. Just saying, if we close our eyes, it'll go away. Could also look at it from a Freudian point of view. Now, while there's not a lot of sexuality going on in this story, there is definitely a situation where Prospero has a conflict. He has a responsibility, which his superego says he should be taken care of. And his id is saying, go protect yourself. Forget the rest of the world. Take care of yourself. Go up and have the party. Go have fun. Don't worry about the rest of the world. They can't take care of themselves. That's their problem. You're rich, you're super powerful, you deserve to live, let them die. And his ego has to try to resolve the problem. Of course, his ego listens to id and says, let's go party. So, you could also look at the phase of development that Prospero is in. Is he still in the oral stage? Is he gratifying himself with lots of food and drink? Is he in the anal stage where he's saying, I can control this, no disease is going to get to me, who dares defile my party? Is he the ultimate control freak? You could look at things from that point of view. Definitely no case of Oedipus complex going on here, though. So these are just some examples of how you could be interpreting the story of the Masque of the Red Death. Now what I want you to do is I want you to look at the story, and I want you to think in terms of new criticism. I want you to think about how it applies to us today. Why does this story still resonate with us? We read this, we go, wow, I know what he was talking about. So, in 3 to 4 pages, what I want you to do is not so much analyze the story of Masque of the Red Death, because I've already done that for you, but I want you to think about how it applies to us today. So, I want you to find an article right here. See, find an article. Check in the newspaper, in a magazine, find it online, I don't care. But I want you to find a good article from a reliable, responsible source, not somebody's blog, that explains the issue that you want to compare to Masque of the Red Death. So if you want to talk about global warming, if you want to talk about let's see, the problem with we still have all these nuclear weapons, and this is causing problems with Iran and with North Korea, and still, or we could, there's so many different things. Almost any big issue that's happening can be compared, and definitely there's a lot of stuff going on with Corona that you could look at and make a good comparison here. So what I want you to do is do that comparison. Now, you must do it in MLA format for me. And I want you to remember these elements. Remember, we talked about them when we talked about symbolism, Prince Prospero, the responsibilities of the government. Who gets locked out? How do we basically? I want you to look for a problem where their way of dealing with it is by not dealing with it. That's the gates and bolts of the palace. The party, this is how the average person is dealing with this thing, or I should say the people that are ignoring the problem. How are they just like pretending it doesn't exist and going on with their life? And here in America, like if you were to do Corona, you could easily talk about these people who don't care about the virus spreading and are just saying, we've got to get back to work. I want to be able to go to the movies. I want to be able to go to the beach. This really sucks being in my house. I'm not trying to make fun of people who feel that way. I'm just saying that would be one way that you could compare it. Okay, the gigantic clock. The easiest way to look at the clock is it's the news. We're constantly being reminded. 3 or 4 times a day the news comes on. The newspaper comes out. There are reports. They're trying to tell us, hey folks, look, this is what's happening. How are people responding to that? If we talk about global warming, most people say, I don't believe in it. It's not real. Or we look at it and say, gosh, that's pretty real. This is scary. What's our government doing about it? I don't know what to do about it. Is anybody doing anything about it? I don't know. And of course, the stranger, the intruder who comes in at the end. He basically represents the problem itself. What's it going to do to us if we continue to ignore it? Now, it doesn't always mean death. It can mean that we lose something as a result. We lose a freedom. We lose the ability to do something. Something gets taken away. But in a lot of cases, death is the result. So basically, it should be when you write this paper, you give me an introduction, you introduce the essay. You introduce the article. So in that first paragraph, I want you to tell me the title of the article and the author of that article. Then explain what the article was about. The second paragraph, you then say, this reminds me of Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death. And then you can go on to start talking about Prince Prospero and show how he connects. Third paragraph, talk about the gates and bolts of the palace and how these people are ignoring the problem. Fourth paragraph, talk about how people are just going about their lives like this thing didn't even exist. The next paragraph, the clock. How are we being reminded that the problem exists? And so on. Okay, so you can see how this builds up. Your final paragraph is your conclusion. What's going to happen if we continue like Prospero and just ignore this problem? What do you think the results are going to be? Okay. If you have any problems, if you're having trouble finding an article, please contact me. Now, I want to show you, this is an example of an article. This was from last year. the government is still shut down. So remember last year when, yeah, a year ago January, so it's a little more than about a year and a half ago, when Trump just said, I'm not going to open the government back up until Congress figures out a budget. But yet Congress sent him a budget and he vetoed it and sent it back to them and said, I don't like it, do another again, do it again. So basically he says, I'm not going to open up the government until I get what I want. And he basically was holding the country hostage because, you know, the government runs a lot of things that aren't going to be working if the government's not working. So, you know, read through this article and just basically talked about how Trump was being like Prospero, and his life was still fine. Nobody shut down the White House. The White House kept running, so he wasn't worried. But then we looked at how by locking the gates and bolts of the palace, in other words, by shutting down the government, he was locking the rest of us out. And what was this doing to the average person? How were they suffering because these different services that the government gives us weren't funded, so they couldn't operate? And so on down the line. How are we being reminded? Well, things like the Senate and the news are trying to keep reminding us, hey, we're working on the problem, we're trying to get something done, and so on down the line, until you finally get to who is the stranger. Well, the stranger is the fact that people are going to be suffering. There are going to be people who die because they can't go to the hospital because they're not getting their Medicare, things like that. So, see how that works. And also, I do want you to give me a citation at the end showing what the name of the article was and all that important information, so I can find the article again if I need to. Alright, so that's what the article would look like. Here's what the essay might look like. Notice MLA format. So we have our MLA format. Notice up here my name and my page number. So look, here we go, first paragraph. It seems like things never changed. Talking about the lower class toils while the upper class profits, and we can see that in this situation. Now, I actually broke into another paragraph. I had a lot to say, but notice I finally get to it. The government is still shut down, an article by so-and-so, okay? Then I summarized the article real quick. Then I actually compared it to Masque of the Red Death, and then here I tell you, Trump is like Prince Prospero. And just like Prospero welded the gates of his palace shut, Trump wants to build a wall to keep illegal immigrants out of Mexico, and he's thinking all these different, I'm not sure what I was doing there, but while Prospero and his friends reveled in the halls, we have, oh, this was great, this great quote here. The Commerce Secretary said that he doesn't understand why unpaid federal workers just don't get a bank loan. God. So you see how this works? So you can look at this and get a good example of how it runs. And I think 3 to 4 pages is probably a little bit much. Probably more like 2 to 3 pages. Yeah, 2 to 3 pages will do it. I'll go back and change that in the directions. So, like I said, if you have any questions, please email me or call me. You have my phone number. Right over here. So don't forget also to check the daily Avengers, yeah, the daily agenda for what you missed in class that day. Basically, this is what we talked about. This video will be posted here shortly. And also, before next class, I want you to somehow obtain the movie Pleasantville and watch it. You can watch it for free on Stars on Amazon, but you have to sign up and then quickly cancel your free trial. If you have any of these services like Hulu, Amazon Prime, iTunes, Vudu, YouTube, Google Play, you can rent it for $3. Hopefully, maybe you even have a friend that has a copy. Go borrow it. Oh, wait a minute, we're not allowed to talk to people right now. Ooh, could have germs on that copy. Ooh, sorry. Forget I said that. But it's a very interesting movie, and I want to talk about it some more next class. So it's really important that you see it so you have some idea what I am talking about. All right, take care one and all, and I will see you soon, or talk to you soon.